Well, hello everyone. We're at the Rock and Dough restaurant here in Jackson, Tennessee, and who do I have here? My good friend Perry Huntoon, American Vice President of the International Club Crosby, and it was actually Bing Crosby that brought us together and the club. And I think it's been 3 years since you've last been here.
It's going, I guess it had to be 2019.
2019, that's right.
Just before COVID hit.
That's right. So this is Memorial Day 2022, and you're back. You've been at the Indy 500. How about that? Is that something you do every year?
Yeah, that's been an annual tradition with me and my son from the 90s on. I lived in Indianapolis, and about probably 1991, got my first ticket to the race. And then my son said, hey, this is fun. Let's do it, and we've been doing it almost ever since. I think we missed 1 or 2 years, that's all. Great tradition.
And what brings you to Jackson besides seeing me? You're traveling around the country, is that right?
I have a conference in Pittsburgh, Kansas, the Jefferson Highway Association, and I thought to make a little detour through Jackson to see you and reminisce about Bing a little bit and over some food. It would be a great way to get going up for the end of the weekend.
Well, what about the pizza? Did you like the pizza here?
Yes.
Now, I know that 3 years ago we were exactly at the same place. You probably think that Jackson only has one restaurant.
I figured this is it. There's no more.
Well, we're outside here, and it's pretty nice weather, and so.
Well, it's warm, but it's a lot more comfortable sitting outside in the early evening than it would be inside with the chilled air conditioning. Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about Bing then. How did you first listen to Bing Crosby? When was that? What attracted you to his music?
The deal with me is I grew up musically just before rock and roll hit. We're talking specifically 1953. That's when I came of age musically. But before that, as a younger child, so to speak, I was exposed to Bing through my aunt and uncle who had relatives who played Bing Crosby records on a Sunday afternoon, while we were chit-chatting or playing a game or whatever. So I was exposed to that late 40s Bing, the Dear Hearts and Gentle People, Mule Train, those are two I remember vividly from that period. That was big. So 1953, when I came of age musically, Bing was still being heard on the radio. They had a show on a New York station, WMCA, late afternoon, Bing and Friends, and they played Bing, and they'd intersperse some of the other singers of the day. And I just remember being annoyed, thinking that Bing sang with almost everybody. He had duets, whatever. But they're not playing those, they're just taking a Peggy Lee or whoever and doing an individual thing by her. So it wasn't 100% Bing anymore, it was Bing and Friend. But that was still a good half hour every day of the week, Monday through Friday. So, hey, he had the best voice, he was it. I loved it. But he wasn't having hit parade songs at that time, but they were playing his contemporary songs, but they just weren't going up into the top 10 or top 20 at the point. So I got into that and I listened to Tony Bennett, I listened to Frankie Lane, I listened to some of the others, but Bing had the voice. Bing just personified the music I liked. And I liked the big bands also. And I knew he had a background, he sang, recorded with Jimmy Dorsey, he recorded other bands. And they always sounded good. I didn't know all the details at that time. I had no idea that Jimmy Dorsey, for instance, was the first band backing him on the Kraft Music Hall. That was well before I was aware of any of that stuff. So that Bing, the Bing voice of the 40s and the early 50s, I would go to record stores, and Decca was reissuing all that stuff on 45. I was buying 45. So I could go back. I could buy records that were from 1940, the early 40s on 45. Play them like they were just recorded yesterday. I loved it. So that comprised a big part of my 45 RPM collection at the time. I was into jazz at the time too, Count Basie, Gene Krupa, people like that. But for a pop singer, Bing Crosby, I thought, well, sure, Frankie Lane, Joe Stafford, the Hilltoppers,
Oh, yeah.
as an example. And then, who came along? Bill Haley and the Comets.
And rock and roll.
I dovetailed into that. But then, I don't know, that wore off, and as the music changed by 57, 58, I tuned out of the pop market, and I just went back in time.
Mm-hmm.
And back in time took me to Bing Crosby's heyday. Then I'm back in the 40s. I wasn't so much into the 30s, but the 40s, the early 50s, I love that period.
Now, what was it about the Bing Crosby of the 40s that you liked so much, as compared with the Bing from 1930s? Because for me, I think I was telling you before that for me, it was Bing Crosby in the 30s first. That's what I first heard. Songs like Sentimental and Melancholy, Sweet Georgia Brown, Please. All of those hits from the 30s, early records that he made. Don't Be That Way.
Well, my problem was I was into the big bands, and my cutoff was basically 1935. Anything before that sounded very dated, not something you would listen to 20 years later. Where when Benny Goodman came in, and then Glenn Miller, Artie Shaw, and them, that stuff still sounded good in the 50s. Mm-hmm. It still sounds good now.
Oh, yeah.
But stuff from the earlier period always sounded dated. And I thought the Bing Crosby songs also had that dated feeling. The orchestrations did. They weren't things you would listen to in the 50s. So I didn't. Until I bought a 78 RPM record of Down the Old Ox Road. And I loved it. Mm-hmm. But it was an anomaly. It was something out of kilter with the rest of the Bing. I had that 178, and I thought it was a curiosity piece. It wasn't until years later that I realized the voice of Bing in the 30s was as good as it gets. And he was so far ahead of his time. But when I was a teenager, I didn't know that history. I didn't know what preceded Bing. I didn't know about singers like Jolson that belted them out, because you didn't have the microphone, the electrical recording. And so they were song belters. Bing could caress a microphone. He learned how to do it and did it effectively. Mm-hmm. And it changed the whole style of music. And the earlier singers, Irish tenor type voices,
John
that
McCormack,
was more the tradition. The baritone wasn't the voice. I didn't like singing of the early 30s, so I ignored it all. And then all of a sudden you realize Bing is doing this stuff back then. Mm-hmm. He sounds pretty good. But it took me a while. It took me quite a while.
Well, the thing about Bing is that he also, in so many ways, he influenced so many of the later generation of singers, not just Sinatra. Sinatra tried to move away from the Bing sound, but there were many singers in the big band era that were still trying to sound like Bing Crosby. People like Perry Como, like Dick Haymes, even somebody who was already
like
running.
Dean Martin.
Dean Martin, exactly.
Definitely.
I was thinking of Buddy Clark, for example.
Buddy Clark. Yes. I realized Bing was it. Everybody thought he's the epitome, and if we sound like him, we're going to make it. And some did. There were a lot of very good singers of the late 30s, particularly those that came out of the big bands. Some of them made it big. Most of them did beyond the big band period, and I think it's a shame. Mm-hmm. Or there was something that came along later, and it was too late. The musical scene had changed a lot. But Bing was the influence. He influenced a whole generation of new singers in that pre-rock period. Sinatra being the most paramount one, of course. And sure, Frank had to get his own style. You can't be a clone of Bing Crosby, and there's only one Crosby. What's the point?
Which I think Sinatra himself said that there's only one Crosby on some recording. I think there's that song that he did for V-Discs. Dick Haymes, Dick Todd, and Como, and that's in that song he says there's just one Crosby. But in reality, I find it very interesting when we discuss the relationship between Bing and Frank. I find it really interesting how, if you think, for example, about many of the songs that Sinatra did with Tommy Dorsey, for example, a lot of them were really Bing Crosby songs or songs associated with Bing. And then in the Columbia period, he recorded a lot of songs that were associated with Bing, like Ghost of a Chance, which Bing partly wrote, and Paradise, and a lot of those songs became known because of the Bing Crosby versions, and Sinatra kind of took them and reworked them somehow.
Yeah, I found it interesting. When I realized that Bing typically recorded for Decca his movie songs. You make a movie and they do the 4 or so songs from the movie, and typically one or at least one of them would become a big hit. And sometimes the first version of those songs I heard was by a big band instead, with a singer like Frank or whatever. And I didn't realize at that time, because I was too young and I wasn't into those old Crosby movies then. I knew the road pictures, but I didn't know those earlier ones with all the songs. And my God, these are big Crosby songs these people were all doing, And it was amazing. And then when I finally got charts, to show what the hit records were, there's Bing Crosby with the top version,
Yeah, I'm thinking of something like, Too Romantic, or, Moonlight Becomes You from Road to Morocco, or, those were endlessly covered by other bands, but Bing had the original version of those.
He had the original version, and I liked the cover versions, because I liked the bands. I love the Tommy Dorsey band, for instance, I would rather listen to that band than we'll say John Scott Trotter as an orchestration. But Bing did his thing, and Trotter was very good for him, I found it interesting to discover that Jimmy Dorsey was the original band at the Kraft Music Hall, and I had never heard a recording from that for years.
And also recorded with Bing, I think, like songs like June and January, maybe. I think Jimmy Dorsey's on that.
Bing did a few sessions with Dorsey in the 1936-7 period, and I loved them. We loved them. And then even in the 40s, after the war, 45, 46, they did a few, and I always thought, Bing had the best background. I loved that with the Dorsey sound, it was wonderful. But when I listened to some of the old Kraft Music Halls from 36 and 7, the Dorsey band doesn't come through well. They're strictly in the background. They're not being their usual. So it was a bit of a disappointment, to hear that stuff. And the fidelity wasn't very good. So the commercial recordings turned out to be much better as it turned out. Even though by that point, Bing was moving on to John Scott Trotter, using him as an orchestral director. And I love that stuff,
What do you think Bing never made a point to actually make commercial recordings with some of the big bands? Was it because the big bands already had their own singers, or because maybe Bing was such a big star that that he wouldn't necessarily sing with those bands? Because it would have been wonderful to have seen that.
I think it's the industry. Number one, you didn't cross-pollinate. If you recorded for RCA, that's it. They wouldn't allow you to be a guest on a Decca record or a Columbia record.
Unless it's a V-disc, I guess.
That was so rare. So that's why I treasure the fact that Jimmy Dorsey was signed to Decca, and so was Bing, so they could do it. Or years later, Tommy Dorsey and Bing could record a session together because they were both with Decca. Otherwise,
I guess it's the same thing with Sinatra and Harry James. When they were both recording for Columbia in the 40s, they were able to do a few songs together.
One session in the early 50s there. Castle Rock, I think, is a great record. Some don't like it. I think it's just wonderful. It's a nice reunion.
And I think there's also Farewell to Love, which is a pretty good song too. Sounds wonderful. By the 1950s, though, it seems to me like Bing Crosby was not interested really in having hits anymore. How do you see that? Because I feel like Frank Sinatra, for example, was always interested in being in the limelight and having hits, even into the 1970s. But Bing Crosby, after a while, he realized that maybe not being on the charts that much didn't matter as much, right?
I think there's some truth to that. You have to look at them differently. Bing was an amazing success in the 1940s. If you thought he was good in the 30s, the 40s were just magnificent. It wasn't just the records. He was a box office star. He was a top box office star for like 5 years in a row in the second half of the 40s. And people wouldn't have any idea that that's true. When you think of Hollywood male actors, you don't think of Bing Crosby.
No, you think of
Clark Gable, you think of Jimmy
Cary
Stewart,
Grant, Jimmy Stewart,
Humphrey Bogart, all these stars. Bing Crosby was number one at the box office. Well, okay, that's the 40s. Now we're into the 50s. The musical scene had changed. I mean, I listened to the pop music in the post-war period compared to the pre-war period or the war period. It's quite different. And I think what the big difference was, to me anyway, much of the music that came out of the 30s came from Broadway.
Mm-hmm.
And you had some of the greatest writers, the Gershwins, you know, Jerome Kern,
Cole Porter.
Ira Larlin, you could name them, just cranking out hit after hit for Tin Pan Alley. In the late 40s, it was a different game. There was more novelty stuff. Yeah. And the bands weren't as important.
Mitch Miller.
And I don't know, the hits were there, but it was a different style. It wasn't, we weren't into rock or anything like that, but it was just a little more corny. It wasn't, the lyrics weren't there. They just weren't there for the most part. And I can't account for that, you know. Did people just run out of gas, or is it just that they moved on? I think Bing recognized that. I think he recognized that. He had made his part. He had done what he did. He knew the 30s, the 40s, you've had 2 decades being at the top of your game. Generations move on. Mm-hmm. Some people are reluctant to acknowledge that. You know, they want to continue. Sinatra was a little bit younger. And he had hit the skids, you know, as you recall, you know, by the end of the 40s, going into 1950, 51, a lot of people thought he was a has-been. His career was over.
But I think at the same time that allowed him to actually get around to projects that he wanted to do himself that really meant something to him. And there are 2 albums in particular from the 50s that I really love. One of them is Bing with a Beat. Mm-hmm. And I think that shows his love of the Dixieland jazz. What do you think about that album with Bob Scobie?
That is my favorite album that Bing ever did.
It is to me as well, and it always has been.
I did not know Bob Scobie from anybody. Who was Bob Scobie? I didn't know him.
I only knew him after he recorded with Bing.
Exactly. I have since picked up other albums by him. I know his story pretty well, but he was an unknown name to me. Because he didn't come out of the New York crowd, you know, of the Dixielanders. I associated, the Eddie Condon style, which was not really Dixieland, but it had that flavor, you know. Mm-hmm. And Bob Scobie was a West Coast guy. I didn't know that style. That album just hit me beautifully. Well, who did he record that for? RCA Victor. The Decca contract was over. He wasn't glued to Decca. He wasn't glued to Jack Cap anymore, who controlled his recording. And Bing was now on his own to do what he wanted. And I think he picked some good, I think he picked some mediocre things to do. That is one of the absolute highlights. That and the Bing sings about Dresden Swing.
And that's another one that I've always loved.
Those are the 2 albums from the 50s.
That one he did for Verve Records, Norman Grantz's Verve Records, and that has Buddy Bregman arranging, and this has created some, I guess, controversy among the Bing Crosby fans, including dogs that might be around here that may not like this album because I hear some barking. But what do you think about that album? I've always loved that album with Buddy Bregman.
Well, let me go back. When Frank Sinatra went to Capitol and started recording with Nelson Riddle, and he did things like A Swinging Affair, Songs for Swinging Lovers, I thought, there's nothing better. This is absolutely fantastic. And then I thought, God, why couldn't Bing have a arranger like Nelson Riddle? And then the more I thought about it, I realized Bing's style was different than Frank's. Frank's a little more aggressive, Bing's a little more laid back, a little more mellow. And maybe that wouldn't work as well. So Sinatra found his perfect mate, although he had to be dragged kicking and screaming because he wanted to bring Axel Stortel with him.
It's also interesting that he didn't only record with Nelson Riddle, but he also made records with Billy May, with Gordon Jenkins.
Well, he had a lot of arrangers that did wonderful things for him. Nelson Riddle stands out. Billy May did well. He did one with Neil Hefti a few years later.
Oh, yeah, with Count Basie, yeah.
But I thought Bing would have been better paired up with somebody like Les Brown, a little more gentle. And for whatever reason, they only made that one single together, which I really enjoyed, but it never went anywhere on the charts. But I thought, boy, they could have done, they're both under contract to Decca. Les was with the Coral subsidiary, but the point is they were together. It could have happened. I think it should have happened. I think that would have been one of the great things. They would have been because Les had a slightly more gentle swinging sound.
Now that is a band I really love. The Les Brown, the band of renown, and it really was, and it launched the career of Doris Day, for example.
Well, it was a great band. I always think it's been underrated. A lot of people just remember it as being Bob Hope's backup band on all his shows, right? But you don't know. I will like it. I'll tell you who else I like being with, Guy Lombardo. And that could be a mismatch under certain circumstances. I only knew the one single they did. Here he did Frank's Young at Heart. I love that much better than Frank's version because of the Lombardo sound behind it. And I like the flip side too. And I thought, oh, this is a match made in heaven.
I actually feel like Bing would work really well with Guy Lombardo for ballads, don't you think?
Well, I didn't know at the time that he had recorded with Lombardo, 20 years earlier and did three sides, that now that I listen to him, oh my God, that stuff is wonderful too, But a lot of people, I think, oh no, Guy Lombardo is one thing and Bing Crosby something totally different. But I would have loved to see them make an album today. I would have, in the later days, loved to have seen Bing reprise the Bob Scobie thing with the world's greatest jazz band of Yank Lawson and Bob Haggard.
That would have been wonderful,
I think they could have done, because Bing had recorded with Bob Crosby's Bobcats, in the earlier days. They could have made a new album, new arrangements of more contemporary songs. I think that would have been one of the greatest things ever.
There's always some of those projects that we wish they had done, but and then they never materialized. Like Frank Sinatra recording an album just with Bill Miller on piano, that like Tony Bennett did with Bill Evans. That would have been wonderful. But going back to Buddy Bregman, why do you think that album has been criticized so much? I just think it's a wonder of an album, and I wish that Bing had recorded more for Verve, and I wish that he had recorded more with Buddy Bregman.
Buddy, I think, was a boy genius. I didn't know him before that album, and I didn't know anything about him. I've met him and talked to him, and I was astounded because he learned a lot from Nelson Riddle. I mean, he basically was the poor man's Nelson Riddle for Norman Granz. Norman Granz couldn't get Nelson, so he got Buddy, and then finally he was able to get Nelson to do some of the Ella Songbook albums, because Buddy did the first two, if you may recall. First two of the Songbook album, and he had done the Bing Crosby album. Norman Granz didn't take any part in the Bing Crosby album. Buddy Bregman, though, was a good friend of who? Gary Crosby. They were buddies. They were of the same generation. And Buddy Bregman recorded Gary for some of his Decca singles, which were trying to be pop tunes of 1954, 55, whatever period. They didn't do much, but that's where I first heard Buddy's name. But with Bing, it was a business arrangement. They didn't know each other. I thought Buddy did wonderful. The criticism I hear is that the sound is a little too brassy and it overwhelms Bing. I don't find it that way at all.
No, I don't either. In fact, if you think of songs on that album like Mountain Greenery, I think the arrangement actually works around his voice more than it actually overpowers or overshadows his voice. And in fact, I think Buddy Bregman understood that really well also with Ella Fitzgerald, and the very first time I ever heard his name was actually on that Cole Porter Songbook album you were mentioning before, even before I heard the Crosby album. But I think it's got so many great, jazz musicians in the band, and the charts are just, I think they're perfect for Bing's voice. That's my understanding of it.
I had wished that they could have done a reprise of that album and done more. There was a one-time thing. I don't know what Bing's feeling. I don't know financially or what, the Decca contract, the exclusive Decca contract had ended. And Bing was free to do what he wanted with who he wanted. And the RCA Victor was a one-time thing, but then he did Rosemary Clooney. You know, he did the duets with Rosie on RCA.
And those had Billy May as arranger too. The Fancy Meeting You Hear album, Rosemary Clooney, Bing Crosby, and Billy May taking a trek around the world, right? It's something that I found pretty interesting. I don't know what you think about this. When people compare Bing and Frank Sinatra, one of the things that often gets mentioned is that Bing Crosby was not as interested in doing concept albums. Do you agree with that? Why do you think that is? Because definitely Sinatra was one of the inventors, or at least one of the pioneers of the concept album way before, Pink Floyd or the Beatles or any of those guys, The Who, Why do you think Bing Crosby did not record more concept albums like Frank Sinatra did?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I've never had an answer for this. I don't know. I wonder if it was because he came from an era of more, singles recordings, and he didn't think as much in terms of albums as Frank Sinatra did in the 50s. But he evidently did, because those two albums with Scobie and with Bregman, in a way, they are concept albums. The Swinging Bing, the Dixieland Bing, but he just never took it any further than that.
Well, it's funny because I remember reading the liner notes once on one of the early 10-inch albums that he did with a buddy called Trio. And somebody said, that's the first concept album. Well, I think that's a little bit of a stretch. Nobody was considering things in that term at all,
No.
But they say, see, that beats Sinatra, or they're just trying to say, hey, he actually did before Sinatra did. Well, you could say what you will, but Sinatra really had that idea. I never, as much as I like Sinatra, I never cared that much for some of those albums. I liked his swinging stuff.
But not the ballads so much?
For Bing, I listened to it all. But I will say this, when I reach for Bing Crosby on my shelf, I find I'm going more into the albums than I am to a collection of these singles. I find if you listen to them chronologically in the 40s, there's a lot of dreary music there. I mean, the performances are wonderful, but the songs are, sometimes they go back to 1910. They're ancient songs, or they're just songs that are out of kilter with the present day. And yeah, he does a magnificent job on them, but they're not the songs that you want to listen to. Mm-hmm. I struggle with that a little bit because I like to play things chronologically. I like to pull this stuff out, but I find I was in Europe a few years ago, and somebody put on a station. They're playing some Bing Crosby stuff, and they're playing stuff from like 1945, 46, but they're picking the best of. Chronologically, and my God, it all swung. It was all wonderful because they got rid of that stuff that was gloomy or didn't do well. And I said, my God, this is so wonderful. But I don't listen to it that way because I'm getting all those other mediocre songs in the middle.
I see.
But mediocre as they are, they're good performances. It's not because Bing's performance is mediocre. It's just the material. Mm-hmm. But Jack Capp did that. He wanted Bing to become Mr. Everyman. He wanted to appeal to
record all different kinds
group.
Of stuff, yeah.
And I partly criticize that because I think Bing's natural regime would have been more into the jazzier side. But let's face it, jazz had a short-lived life, as far as a popular form of music. What did Jack Capp do for him? He made him the biggest star.
Absolutely.
I can't criticize that. But I can criticize some of the recordings that they did, that's all.
Now, you mentioned jazz, and I think that Bing was naturally suited to jazz. What do you think about Bing Crosby as a jazz singer?
I think he had a very natural affinity for it. He could recognize the beat. He could go with it. I love him as a jazz singer. I go back to the things like Sweet Georgia Brown.
Oh, yeah.
He did with Ice and Jones.
What a great band.
And some of the stuff, he grew up with the Whiteman Band, and who was there? Big Spider Band, the Innovators,
Frankie Trumbauer.
Yeah, and the Dorsey brothers, for God's sakes. These guys were the A1 musicians, who did they respect? Bing, because he met their talent level. He was right up there with them on the vocal side, and he could just move right in with them so beautifully.
I think that's one of the reasons.
The fact that he could record more along those lines.
And I think that's one of the reasons why I am so attracted to Bing's 30s recordings, because they're just so jazzy. Even the ballads, when he sings, a ballad like June and January, or, Please, which supposedly inspired John Lennon to write Please Please Me, they say. But in any case, all those, even the ballads, when Bing sings those, With Every Breath I Take, it doesn't matter which one it is. There's some jazz element to those recordings, and that's why I'm just so drawn to those recordings, because I'm a jazz fan, and I was listening to jazz even before I was listening to Bing Crosby.
Well,
and I realized how great a
too.
jazz singer he was.
Sure. And the fact, Bing sang with Whiteman. That was a big organization, of course, but it had its jazz element. He's with Gus Arnheim, which was not a jazz band by any means, but you're talking about precision, and you had to have good musicians, which they did. And then there's later recordings with somebody like Jimmy Greer, for instance. Boy, they were good. They just absolutely grabbed me, and I loved it whenever he could sing with a big band, whether it was either of the Dorseys or somebody else. But the sad thing is, because of what we talked about earlier, record contracts, you couldn't jump across the labels. You had to do it within that stable, and that limited you. So I can enjoy it with Xavier Cugat, for instance, as an example.
You don't have to know the language, right? I think that's one of the ones they did. Or I don't know if that was Bing or if that was Buddy Clark, but yeah, absolutely.
But I particularly, I liked him with the Dorseys, and I think that was it. And to record Dick Todd, for example, the so-called Canadian Bing Crosby, he's recording a lot of the same type of stuff around 1940, 41. And what is he doing it with a background? What sounds like a traditional 16-piece swing band. And I really like that. I liked his backings better than what John Trotter was doing for Bing. Oh, I liked the Bing recordings better, but I could listen to all those Dick Todd recordings, and because the orchestrations are so well done. They're very well done. And I don't even know who they were. I don't know. I mean, a studio band, I'm sure, but it was the traditional, brass, reeds, rhythm section, like any other big band of the time. And I like that stuff. I really like it. I wish Bing had done more along those lines. But Jack Kapp, well, look at the Hawaiian genre he got into, and he made that his own. And I love all those, But Jack Kapp even had Louis Armstrong doing Hawaiian stuff. That doesn't go over quite as well. With Bing, it works.
Yeah, and I like some of the intimate recordings that Bing Crosby made in the 1940s. Songs like I Can't Begin to Tell You, or It's Been a Long, Long Time with the Les Paul Trio. I wish he'd made more of those, because I think that Bing Crosby, in a small group jazz setting, I think that's very well suited to him. And fortunately, we have all of those recordings that he made in the 50s with Buddy Cole for CBS Radio. What do you think about those sessions? Some people criticize the.
Well, I struggle with them a little bit. They were done on the cheap and on the quick. One take, boom, boom, boom. You just sing the song, and Buddy does his thing. Buddy was innovative sometimes with a little licks of this and that some people don't like as well. But I think it's very mellow music, but it's not music for the ages. They're not recordings for the ages. They served a purpose. He was doing a radio show. I was listening to his show, 15 minutes every day for a while, and it was perfect to do that. You're not going to have a big full orchestra behind you for a 15-minute show. So it worked. But I found the Mosaic set is very good, but it is not one of Mosaic's bigger sellers. That set is still in print. where their sets tend to go out of print.
Do you think that could also have something to do with the fact that some people don't recognize Bing Crosby as a jazz musician in the way that they recognize, say, Charlie Parker or,
and you're right.
Duke Ellington?
The Mosaic crowd is looking for the jazz, and I wouldn't call that Mosaic set jazz. I really wouldn't call it jazz.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very mellow. I think Buddy did a nice job with it. I mean, I think Buddy Cole was very good.
I particularly like them because of what I was saying before. I wish that Bing had made more recordings in a small group setting, because I think that was well suited to him. And in the way that Billie Holiday made so many records in that kind of setting for Verve.
Well, what he did, or when Decca issued In a Little Spanish Town as a single, I did not know that this was the previous recording that he was doing for radio, but they put that out, and then they put a second one out. I had Swanee River was on there. I forget what the other sides were now, but I was so taken with this.
Mm-hmm.
I said the style was different. It was more intimate, but it had a little bit of a swinging sound to it, and I thought, wow, this is the new Crosby.
Mm-hmm.
I was telling all my teenage friends, you've got to listen to this record, In a Little Spanish Town. I didn't even know it was an old song. I never heard the song before. I thought it was magnificent.
Mm-hmm.
And all it is, the Buddy Cole Trio, It wasn't a big band, anything, but that style absolutely grabbed me, and I thought, my God. Well, that was it, these are...
Well, yeah, and
they
that
were able
sounds...
to take them, and they got played on the radio. They didn't make top 10 or top 20 songs, but they got some play. And I was just mesmerized. I thought, my God, Bing has really made a comeback here, style-wise.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, he went on album-wise with the Scobie album we talked about earlier, which I thought was an absolute gas.
Mm-hmm.
But, before that, I remember my uncle bought the Rosemary Clooney Bings and whatever it was, where they're going around the world with all this other.
Fancy meeting you here.
I said, oh, what did you get? He said, oh, you wouldn't like it. Well, of course I would. Why wouldn't I like it? It's Bing Crosby, right? But he didn't think I would care for something like that.
I think Bing Crosby and Rosemary Clooney just understood each other so well. Those records, the Fancy Meeting You Hear, but also that Traveling 2 Beat, which came later on in the 60s, those are pretty good albums, a lot of fun.
Yeah, for some reason the Traveling 2 Beat didn't grab me as well as the first one.
I agree. I think the first one's better.
It's Billy May in both times. You got the same two singers. They're both still at the top of their game, but that one didn't quite have the, I don't know.
I think it's the repertoire in many ways. I think the songs on Fancy Meeting You Hear are just better songs.
Yeah, that's...
I Can't Get Started,
But I put them both together on a CD, so I've got it all there.
Exactly, I do too.
That's the way to do it.
Now, that second one, the Traveling 2 Beat, came out in the 60s. Do you think his output kind of took a downturn in the 60s, or are there still recordings from the 60s that you really, really like that Bing Crosby made?
I'm sorry, I didn't get...
Are there any, do you think the quality of Bing's recordings in the 60s, do you think it went down, or are there any records that you still really think are memorable?
I ignored Bing in the 60s until he did the Hey Jude album.
Uh-huh.
And that one grabbed me. He said after he made that album, that was his last, that was it, he's done. And I took him for a word, but I loved it. I thought, oh, this is good. But I felt that the reception wasn't very good among Bing Crosby fans. You don't emulate the Beatles and all that, you're big, you don't have to go in that direction. Mm-hmm. I thought it was a very good album. Before that, he did the modern, what is it?
Modern Millie.
Yeah. And I did, and I paid no attention to that album.
Mm-hmm.
I thought the songs were mediocre. I thought that, again, his voice is wonderful, but I thought that was mediocre. The country album he did, I ignored it. I thought if I want the country music, I'll get the country singers to do it. I like it now. Mm-hmm. I think it's good. But then he did the Hawaiian album with Nelson Riddle. I didn't think very highly of
Return
that.
to Paradise Island.
And the stuff he did later for Reprise, some of the small stuff, I think that's a low point of his career.
Mm-hmm.
I really do. I put that all chronologically, and I listened to it, and I think, yeah, he's with the Rat Pack, or whatever, and no, that doesn't work, that's not the thing I want to hear.
Then he also did a collaboration with Count Basie, and that couldn't have been more different from the collaboration that Count Basie did with Frank Sinatra a few years earlier.
I think it's funny that I thought the Sinatra-Basie collaboration was brilliant. Mm-hmm. I think I like Sinatra's Capitol period. When it came to his later period with his own company, I thought the Basie stuff was the epitome of that. Mm-hmm. And he did the 2 studio albums plus the live one at the Sands, and I thought, it doesn't get any better than this. So, but then, oddly enough, he did an album with Ellington that I didn't think came off very well.
Francis K. and Edward K. and Francis A. and Edward K.
Yeah, for some reason that one just didn't seem to have much magic to it. But I thought, pairing up Bing with Basie. The problem with it was the material. Mm-hmm. They didn't pick their own material. They let some young producers pick the material. And so they just kind of went through the motions playing it. I think it sounds good. The more I listen to it, the more I like it. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't grab you like Sinatra did with Basie. He just swung with that band.
I think the difference is that Sinatra with Basie actually went for some of the jazz classics, at least the first album, Sinatra Basie. And it just sounds better. It's just better suited to that band to sing those kinds of songs instead of, say, Little Green Apples.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought the material was contemporary, which I think was what the producers want to do, but that wasn't what the Basie or Bing would have picked themselves. And I think probably the fact that, as I understand, they didn't record together. I think that Bing did it over the soundtrack. I think that might have had a little impact also. Mm-hmm. Because I found it strange because I never heard Bing talk about the album, but Basie was disappointed in it. He said he was disappointed, but he never said why he was disappointed. Mm-hmm. It just didn't come out the way he thought it might, And I agreed at the time because I don't think the album made a big impact, but I like it. I mean, I certainly like it. But that leads you right into the Bing of the 70s, and my God, the resurgence he had with the recordings that he did for the rest of his life. I think after the 60s, this was an amazing comeback.
Mm-hmm. That's what people call a latter-day Bing. The last part of his career in the 1970s, collaborations with Ken Barnes and other arrangers. Some of them recorded in the United Kingdom, actually.
Well, Ken Barnes did some magic, he did a lot to it, but I'll tell you the one album that Bing did on his own, that Southern Memoir album, I think was an absolute classic.
That is actually...
Nobody wanted to do that with it.
That's actually a concept album right there.
Yeah, and I listened to that and I said, gee, that album just faded from view. I didn't even buy it at the time because it just wasn't around, And I thought, well, why is he bothering with something like this? And when I finally got it and listened to it, I said, oh, the songs are wonderful. The arrangements are good. This is maybe as good as it gets. I put it right up there with anything that Ken Barnes did with him. I think it's wonderful.
And some new listeners actually come to Bing through those 1970s albums, which I find quite interesting. Another concept album that he did was that final album, Seasons.
Yes.
What do you think about Seasons? I think everyone seems to agree that that's a really good Bing Crosby album.
It's not my favorite, though. It's not my favorite. I'll tell you what annoyed me about the album was the photo on the cover. It was a very poorly, it was not well done.
I do agree with that, but what about the music?
And I know the photographer, for some reason the photographer didn't like Bing, and it's like it shows, somehow. I don't know. That's a different story. But no, the music is fine. The music is absolutely fine. I play that stuff in the 70s as much as anything now, though.
I agree. Me too.
I appreciate it when all those United Artists songs got together in one big.
That's what life is all about.
That's a wonderful piece of music. But then there were a couple of things I didn't. El Senor Bing, for instance, I didn't think that was.
But that goes back to the 1960s, though. That's an earlier album.
Yeah. Well, he
Or
did,
do you
he
mean
did-
Bingo
he
Viejo?
did
Do you mean
too.
Bingo Viejo?
El Bingo
From
Viejo.
Yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
Yeah. Nice concept, but it didn't have a big impact.
Now, one thing you said that I think is interesting about Sinatra at Reprise, when he collaborated with Count Basie, that was you think some of the best recordings that he made for Reprise are the albums he did with Basie. And one of my favorites though is the one that he made with Antonio Carlos Jobim, the Brazilian bossa nova album. I'm surprised that Bing Crosby did not record a bossa album.
No, we sure didn't. Whether the idea ever came up or anybody suggested it, I don't know.
I kind of think his voice would be suited to that kind of thing because he was one of the pioneers of bringing Hawaiian music into American mainstream pop, even in the 30s with songs like Sweet Leilani and all of those songs. But he didn't seem to be interested in those sounds coming later on, which was also very jazzy coming all the way from Brazil.
Well, it's interesting because Ella did her songbook albums. We talked about it with Cole Porter, the whole litany. And then what happened decades later? She did
An album, a Jobim album, yeah.
And boy, that's considered right up there with her other songbook.
Ella Embraces Jobim, I think it's called, or something like
And
that.
I just acquired that one recently, And I thought, and she did another Cole Porter one too, and another Gershwin one. But the Cole Porter and the Jobim one, boy, they are superb albums. Absolutely superb. I don't know. That doesn't strike me as something Bing would have been able to do like Ella, say, or even. I don't have Frank's album. I don't have that album, but I'm not sure that would have been Bing's material at all. I just don't know. Although he could do everything. I mean, we know he could do everything. But whether the interest level would have been there, I don't know. Yeah, those what ifs are what get you. That's where I went back. God, if he recorded with the world's greatest jazz band, or an album with Les Brown, or even an album with Lombardo, I would have liked that. But it's all, it's all relative. He did his thing, and we have a lot to be thankful for.
Well, absolutely.
Like 2,000 recordings to be thankful for, right?
Yeah.
plus all the live stuff. I mean, we've got a new CD, a double CD coming out again, with more of the radio stuff.
Well, that's one of the things that I've always been interested in, the fact that Bing Crosby was such a big radio star. In those days, Bing Crosby was the radio star. That Kraft Music Hall show in the 40s was the highest rated radio show.
A very big show. Younger people can't relate to that. I grew up, of course, after that age, but I remember radio. I remember people tuning into the radio late night, late evening, because they didn't have TVs yet. Not Kraft Music Hall, that's before my time. But I certainly have listened to a lot of old Jack Benny shows and Bob Hope shows and things like that.
Why do you think Bing was so popular on radio? What made him such a big radio star, do you think? From the recordings that you've heard, from the ones that have been preserved, I think it was very natural.
What I think about him, he could ad-lib. He was very natural. And he had a very quick, sharp mind. He could react to anything that came in front of him. Particularly, listen to some of those rejected records where they go off half-cocked at some point, and he starts ad-libbing, I don't know how many people could do anything like that.
And he did it on movies as well.
And the road pictures are notorious for throwing away the script and ad-libbing, we went through a lot of those scenes, right? He was wonderful at that. He could also put people at ease on the stage doing all this stuff. I remember reading about how the young Andrews sisters were petrified to all of a sudden be standing next to Bing Crosby in front of a microphone. And he knew how to put them at ease. And they performed right up to par, and everything worked. Everybody has that talent. Some people are a little standoffish, or they're just not as comfortable. To him, standing before a microphone seemed to be the most natural thing in the world, you know?
And I think that might be one of the reasons why he made so many great duet recordings. So what are some that come to mind that you really like? Well, for me, by far, Gone Fishing with Louis Armstrong is one of my all-time favorites because it's just so funny, and the rapport between the two of them is just so clearly right there, right on.
I was so puzzled by that recording because it was a one-sided recording. I said, "Where's the flip side with you?"
They were gone fishing, so they just didn't record another one.
I had no idea that it had come from a radio broadcast. And boy, that was almost the first. That may have been the first one deck I ever did. I remember years later when Perry Como recorded Nobody, and then all of a sudden Dr. Decca rushed out this Bing Crosby version, and there's all this applause at the end of it. And I'm thinking, Bing Crosby doesn't make personal appearances like that. Where the heck did this come from? Well, it came from 1947, but I didn't know that at the time, and I loved it. But yeah, Gone Fishing is an absolute classic, They could do it. I think it's funny that Decca took it upon themselves years later to pair son Gary with Louis Armstrong twice. And they're basically reprising that kind of material. And I thought it came off very well. But the public didn't care at that point. It didn't cause a flip. I bought those records when they came out, and here generations later, I talked to some old friend who just discovered them and said, "My God, I never knew Gary Crosby and Louis Armstrong did anything, and isn't this wonderful?" Well, you're 50 years too late.
Well, that album that they made together in 1960, Bing and Satchmo, that also had Billy May as an arranger.
And I didn't think that album had the same charisma.
No.
I didn't know what was wrong with it. I said, "My God, there you got two absolutely masters of their art." And there's nothing magic in there. I don't know why.
I think when they went for the jazzier stuff like Sugar, that Sugar Baby of Mine, when they do that, it works really well. And I just wish they had done more of that instead of just, novelty after novelty.
I was comparing it to the Scobie album of just 2-3 years earlier. And boy, it was a very pale comparison to my knowledge.
Which is interesting because Bob Scobie was greatly influenced by the playing of Louis Armstrong.
I mean, I'm a completist with Louis Armstrong. I have everything from 1923 or whereabouts right up to the end, and there's almost nobody I love better.
I always say that I love almost everything that Louis Armstrong ever recorded, the exception being that country and western album he made at the very end of his career.
Well, yeah. Yeah. Well, I wasn't too enamored with the Disney album either, but a lot of people did like that one. But
including my 8-year-old daughter.
But on the other hand, there's nothing like having a hit record 17 years after you die, right? Which is what he did.
What other duets do you remember with Bing? Besides the ones he did with Louis, there are some other duets that he recorded. Well, of course, with the Andrews Sisters.
Well, those are the big ones. They were all collected together by one of our Crosby Club people, Wig Wiggums, and when you listen to them chronologically, toward the end, the latter ones are lacking a little bit until the very end. The last session is as good as it gets, but there was a dip in there. But the earlier ones, boy, did they nail it, and they were right in the heart of the public pulse at that time. Particularly, during the war. The pistol packing Mama.
Accentuate the positive.
All these things. I can't believe that Jack Kapp had the foresight to think that the Sisters and Bing would be such a combination, because that doesn't always work as well. I can't think of another sister. Well, Perry Como with the Fontaine Sisters later. I like.
I Want to Walk You Home and A You're Adorable.
Boy, and I think some of those records sold pretty well, but they didn't have the impact that Bing and the Andrews Sisters did. Just a few years earlier. They were magic, absolute magic. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Bing. I've done a couple of programs. Bing with the ladies, for instance, all the gals that he recorded.
Yeah.
And some are better than others. Some Judy Garland and him worked beautifully well. Rhonda Fleming, I didn't think played so well. But what are you going to do, you know?
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
try it, and if it works, great. Yeah, I'm just sorry that Bing grew up at an age where those contractual problems kept you from veering out and recording with anybody you wanted to. You know, that's the sad thing.
What do you think of the few recordings that Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra made together? Things like, you know, well, did you ever, you know?
Well, that was fun, but you know, it's a movie thing, and I listened to the. You know, there was an extended 45 version of it, and I think that was very, very well done. But the little stuff with the Rat Pack that came a little bit later, I didn't like very well at all.
The ones I like the most are the ones that they did on radio. You know, when they appeared on radio together and they would sing a song together. Like, for example, there's a medley they did of, I think it's Among My Souvenirs. It's been a long, it's a long trail. There's a long trail of winding, and I can't remember which one the other one was. I think it was Till We Meet Again. Smile the while you kiss me Saturday. You know, I just think that again, it's too bad they didn't get to record more together and actually serious songs, not just novelties for movies. Yeah.
Well, you know, it was a golden age. Between Hollywood and Broadway, that's where the songs, particularly Broadway though. It took me a long time to realize that the songs that I truly loved mostly came from Broadway. Mm-hmm. To a limited degree Hollywood, and then there was just some of the ordinary Tin Pan Alley stuff. But those songwriters that wrote for Broadway just did magnificent work.
Who are your favorite songwriters of that era? I, for example, really love the partnership of Rodgers and Hart. I just think that was a match made in heaven right there.
You know, and I grew up with Rodgers and Hammerstein, right? I mean, the first play I ever saw was South Pacific, Rodgers and Hammerstein, and what was before that, Oklahoma, you know, and who the heck was Hart? What is it? Who is this Hart they talk about? I didn't know who the heck Lorenz Hart was. My God, when I discovered the music there, I said, forget Oscar Hammerstein, it's Rodgers and Hart. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. But you know who else like Harold Arlen?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Arlen was absolutely magnificent. And as far as the lyricist, Johnny Mercer.
Johnny Mercer, I have always thought, Perry, and I have said this on other videos on my YouTube channel, I think that Johnny Mercer is one of the greatest American poets of the 20th century, but he will never get that recognition at universities or in the literary circles because he is considered a songwriter. When they don't realize that, you know, lyrics like Early Autumn, for example, those are poems just as good as any poem ever written in America in the 20th century.
I would have loved to see Bing and Johnny be more duets together. I think they would have been, and were. You know, the very little we have, I think
just like Bing and Fred Astaire did an album together in the 1970s, it would have been good if Johnny Mercer and Bing Crosby had made an album together in the 70s. Yes. Huh?
There's a lot of what if Bing had lived a little longer? Mm-hmm. You know, well, one of the things was another road picture, and then you're thinking, are these guys getting a little bit long-toothed, you know, to be doing that kind of stuff now? I don't know, you know, but or even an album with Bob Hope, but I don't think that would have worked as well. I'd rather have an album with Mercer. Really. I love like The Road to Morocco, that record, you know, but a whole album of that type of material, I wouldn't play very much. You know, it's like comedy albums of the 50s. You play them once and they're funny, but you don't play them repeatedly, you know. You just don't. But Mercer, boy, I listen to all the stuff he did on Capitol with whoever. The Pied Pipers, of course, he did a lot with. But
I love that song they did together, Candy. I Call My Sugar Candy. That's a great record.
I just think, my God, that guy, he could fit into any of those groups so well.
He even made some duets with Nat King Cole. Save the Bones for Henry Jones, and you know some of those, because Henry don't eat no meat, you know. But you know, I think he was good. Mercer was good singing novelty tunes, but also singing ballads, singing swingers. He could sing anything basically.
Yeah, he really could. He could. I never realized just how good he was until I bought a box set of his stuff, you know. And then it was, hey, get me more, you know. And when I filled out my Pied Pipers album, because he was with them an awful lot in the latter part of the 40s. God, that stuff just, you talk about Bing and the Andrews Sisters, or he and the Pied Pipers in a somewhat different way. They were a wonderful combination. Yeah.
What do you think of Bing's recordings with Paul Whiteman? Sometimes those sound a little outdated, but that might be because of the fact that they were made in the late 20s. But at the same time, there are so many great jazz solos on those records that they're just interesting in and of themselves just for that.
You know what I struggle with that stuff? When this stuff is reissued, and especially if Bing doesn't have a solo voice, but he's part of a
trio
quartet or whatever, a choir, and you can't tell that he's in there. And in some cases, they don't know because the recording notes don't specifically say, so it's a guess. Well, maybe he's on this recording, so we'll include it in the chronological Bing Crosby.
But we're not sure, yeah.
Well, what's the point? If you can't distinguish Bing Crosby, there's no point to it. And that stuff doesn't interest me too much, but when he does the solo stuff, boy, some of that is just magnificent. But not the very first. Yes, he gets deeper into the white man.
And I think
Miss Hannah, I love Oh Miss Hannah. I think, oh my God, when he comes in with that, it just carries you right away with it. Just carries you.
And I think that Paul Weinman was sharp enough as a musician, was intelligent enough to realize Bing's potential, because as you listen to those records, you see that just like Sinatra with Dorsey, Bing gets more and more attention as time goes by in his tenure with Whiteman.
Well, I don't know. With Dorsey, what surprised me was I have the chronological Dorsey, 30s and 40s, and it's a mix. You got the instrumentals, you got the male vocals, you got the female vocals, blah, blah, blah. And all of a sudden you hit 1940, and there comes Sinatra, there come the Pied Pipers, there comes Connie Haynes. And
Joe Stafford.
Sinatra. The instrumentals, no such thing. It's all Sinatra. All of a sudden. And this is earlier than I would have expected.
Mm-hmm.
I would have said after a year or so, but all of a sudden it's like all Sinatra. And I'm wondering, why is that? How did that happen so quick, but it did. And, I can't listen to those records and quite get the mystique from those records. Because I could listen to Jack Leonard from 2 years earlier and think he sounded just as good,
Mm-hmm.
But the magic was, well, I don't want to take anything away from Jack Leonard. He was as popular, I think, as a band singer as anybody.
Absolutely.
Bob Everly was right up there too, but Tommy's band was doing better than Jimmy's band, and Jack Leonard, I think, got better recognition. And then what happened when he left Dorsey? That was it. There was no more. Same thing with Bob Everly. But there you are.
To me, one of the attractions of the records that Dorsey made in the 1940s are the arrangement by Cy Oliver, especially on the flag wavers, on the swingers. I just think Cy Oliver was a fantastic arranger and did a lot for the sound of Tommy Dorsey.
To the detriment of Jimmy Lunchwood.
Well, that is true. Those are great records too, though. Before he was hired away by Dorsey, absolutely.
But well, it was a different sound. I love some of the Dorsey instrumentals in the 30s. Dean Kincaid, with some of the Dixie flavored numbers. Even young Bill Finnegan did a thing like Lonesome Road. But Cy Oliver gave a different sound to the band.
Mm-hmm.
And what surprised me though with Cy, there were these blockbuster songs in the early 40s, and he stayed with Dorsey for a long period, but in the later 40s you're not hearing much of Cy Oliver.
No, I think that he stayed with Dorsey until the World War II years. I don't think that he arranged for Dorsey after the end of the war. I think he concentrated more on studio recordings and on leading his own bands, mostly studio bands. But it was in the early 40s, I think, where
well,
he
exactly.
recorded.
But I mean, here he was, even when Dorsey switched to Decca, what did he do? A remake of Opus 1 is Opus 2. You know, things like, a couple of things like that. So, yeah, I think you're right. He wasn't a full-time Dorsey employee at that point, and he did. He had his own band. He had a studio band. He did some recordings, which I don't think are anywhere near as good as the arrangements he did for the Dorsey band. Oddly enough, you know, I mean, I have that material too, but I'm going to listen to his Dorsey stuff. That's it.
If you had to name one band from that era, from the swing era, one or two bands, I take it wouldn't be Dorsey that would be number one for you. Who are the bands from that, or which are the bands from that era that you listen to the most?
Goodman, Dorsey, and Jimmy too, but Tommy more. I particularly like the early Gene Krupa band. I like the early Harry James band before strings. Not the, I think it got a little syrupy with the strings, but that's where he made his money. But I like that 39, 40 into 41. Same with Krupa, 38 up through the Nito Day, Roy Eldridge period, into 43. Absolutely great stuff. Charlie Barnett's another band I particularly like. I'm a big Woody Herman fan, but it's more the post-war Woody than it would be the pre-war Woody. I like the pre-war, but I don't put it on the same level as some of the. Another band I like, Bob Chester. And I like Bob Chester because he had some wonderful singers. His singers, he had Dolores O'Neill, Betty Bradley, Bill Darnell, and I think all of them were top-notch singers, and they knew how to handle a song.
Now, Bob Chester gets sometimes criticized for sounding a little bit too much like Glenn Miller. Do you agree with that? I mean, I don't, that has never been my impression. I do think that he sounds a little bit like that kind of style, but I don't think you can mistake him for Glenn Miller in the least.
Oh, no, I listened to the early Bob Chester, and I didn't pick up on that at all. Then as I got a year into it, yeah, there were some echoes of Miller. And the story was that this was Tommy Dorsey's way of getting back at Glenn Miller, because he had financed Glenn and thought he had a piece of the band, and no, Glenn paid off the debt and said, "You're gone now," you know. And, oh, well, I'm going to get Bob Chester and be a Miller clone, you know, and cut into your earnings. I think that's a bit of hogwash, because Chester had his own sound. I mean, look at the later bands like, say, Ralph Flanagan, which was a direct Miller clone, who had no association with Glenn Miller. He's a fine musician, band sounds good, but a lot of people hate it because this isn't Glenn Miller. You know, they'll take Tex Beneke or Jerry Gray.
Tex Beneke was a great singer too.
And Tex Beneke, I like all that stuff. I find I don't play Glenn Miller that much because it's so played, and it's because of that formula. It's too formulistic.
Do you think that's the reason why Glenn Miller gets such a bad rap, that sometimes gets criticized for not being jazzy enough? But, you know, I think back then there was this distinction between the sweeter bands and then the hotter bands, right?
Well, you had to have a balance, you know, that was the thing. You had to appeal to a broader spectrum. You had your swing kids, you know, who really wanted the hot stuff. You got into World War II, it got more sentimental, you know, and then you got into the ballad stuff, the romantic stuff. I like it all, but I like the pre-war. I realize that my musical tastes are slightly more to the pre-war level. It was a little looser, you know, a little more fun, a little more carefree, and they were young and exuberant, you know. They didn't get stale, they weren't repeating themselves, so it was very dynamic. And most any of those bands could be very hot, you know.
To me, if I had to name one, it would be the Benny Goodman Orchestra. Benny Goodman was the first jazz musician I ever heard from the record collection of my dad. And then also, of course, the 1938 concert at Carnegie Hall. And that made such a big impact on me that I think to this day, Benny Goodman is the jazz musician whose records I cherish the most, and by far the jazz musician by whom I have the most records.
Well, the first jazz record I ever bought was Hi-Fi, 1954. I took it home, I played it, I liked it. High five. I didn't know Benny Goodman at that time. I knew Glenn Miller better, I knew Tommy Dorsey better. Benny Goodman was an unknown. I didn't know he was the king of swing. I just thought he's just one of the old swing band's leaders. I didn't know he was that prominent. I played that, I liked it. I played it for my mother. She said, that's very nice, but you should have heard the band when Harry James, Gene Krupa were in it. Oh, really? Well, the next thing, I bought the, not the Carnegie Hall, but the 1937-38 Jazz Concert #2 series. It blew me away. I said, my God, I've never heard anything like it. So then I got the Carnegie Hall album, and when I heard Sing, 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 I said, that's it. There's nothing to...
The 12-minute version with Jess Stacy and Gene Krupa's solo and all those solos by Harry James.
Here I am today in my car, playing a CD, and all of a sudden, Sing, Sing, Sing pops up. I don't know how it pops up on my car, but it did. And it was the original studio recording, which I knew well, but it wasn't the same as the Carnegie Hall version. Well, that was followed by more Goodman, and the next thing was one of those 1937 hot off-the-air things, and I'm just listening to that drum beat in the back. I'm listening to Krupa in the background, driving that band like crazy. And I think, there's nobody that could do that like him. There's no band that could sound like that but the Goodman Band. And that's the epitome of the swing era.
I take it.
It's all right there.
I take it Krupa is your favorite drummer of that era.
Absolutely. He was my favorite. He was the first musician that I ever decided I want a complete set of his recordings from start to finish. He was the number one. Now there's many, but it took me a long time to get there, and of course, you end up with a lot of schlock. You always do with any artist. But on the whole, when I listen to his band 38, 39, God, it's a wonderful sound.
Ahead of its time, really, with Anita O'Day on vocals, too.
Well, one thing he did, he had some black arrangers that knew how to swing a band. And they were doing things for the black bands, which most of us weren't listening to at the time, or at least widely. And my God, these guys were really, Fred Norman, Elton Hill, people like that were wonderful arrangers. Well, who's ever heard of them? You don't know those names. No, it's wonderful stuff. And when Anita hit the band, she was magic.
Well, and that is really one of the things with Benny Goodman, that he was way ahead of his time also from a social perspective, because if you think of his Benny Goodman quartet, with African-American musicians, white musicians, Jewish musicians all together, and, you have Teddy Wilson, and you have, of course, Gene Krupa and Lionel Hampton, and Benny himself, and that is in a very, highly segregated America.
Well, look at just a few years later, Eddie Condon is doing his town hall concerts, sustained program on NBC Blue Network, half hour every Saturday or so. And then when it came time to think about renewing it, and doing it with a sponsor, no, why not? We can't have integrated bands, that just didn't go.
Well, it happened to Nat King Cole in the 50s on his TV show, which was so good, but it was short-lived in many ways because of the fact that he was an African-American singer headlining on TV, which was not common at all in those days.
Yeah, I grew up in the early 50s, and I can remember one time when Nat King Cole was in Birmingham, and had a bad reception down there, and I'm thinking, what is the matter with these people? This guy was a great artist, I didn't know that. Well, then I go back to the big band days, and you take a Roy Eldridge down south with the Gene Krupa band, he can't even stay in the hotel with you.
Same thing with Billie Holiday and Artie Shaw.
Billie Holiday with Artie Shaw, the same thing. It's almost unbelievable that that's not that long ago. That's basically within my lifetime. But I knew the segregation of the 50s in the South, and growing up in the East, I couldn't understand it, but that was a way of life. But I didn't realize, because Norman Granz integrated, I went to Jazz at the Philharmonic concerts, and, more of the musicians were black than they were white, and nobody cared. You know, there was no animosity about any of that. You loved Dizzy Gillespie or Roy Eldridge or Charlie Shavers or whoever was up on a bandstand.
Oh, Charlie Shavers was wonderful.
You didn't matter who was backing them, you know. White, black, integrated, it all worked.
Well, you mentioned Artie Shaw, or I mentioned Artie Shaw. What's your take on Artie Shaw? He was always seen as one of the more intellectual of the musicians in those days, and I like a lot of his records a lot, and then there are some that I have a hard time getting into.
Well, I like his 38 band particularly well, 38, 39, because of course then he hit it big because what did he do? I'm emulating Benny Goodman. But that wasn't what he really wanted to do, totally. He liked to use strings, and I was not tuned into that quite so well at the time. I thought, ooh, that drags the band down a bit. But you listen to the 1940 material, some of the studio stuff early, and then the working band that he formed right after that. I have no problem with that. But to me, the best Artie Shaw is 1938-39. As a musician, I like Benny better as a clarinetist.
I agree.
Some people, people can hit both sides, and I'm not going to argue with them about it. It's a matter of taste. But I'll listen to a Goodman small group and be fascinated. I listen to the Gramercy Five, and it doesn't do too much for me.
That's what I'm talking about. I usually have a hard time with that harpsichord there in the background. Well, in the foreground in many cases.
That was so that bothered me. I thought, well, if they just had a piano. Well, later on, it was a piano, and it didn't sound any better to me. His early 50s Gramercy, which is the last recordings he made. He made a whole slew of recordings in the early 50s. I don't care for them.
Do you think does that have anything to do with the fact that he was trying to go or cross over more into the bebop?
No, I didn't think that. I just didn't find that it didn't swing for me at all. That was the problem. The Goodman small groups, I particularly liked the trio and the quartet originally. The sextet work, he did Charlie Christian,
yeah.
There. Wonderful music, a little different,
Very bluesy too with Charlie Christian.
Pardon?
Very bluesy with Charlie Christian for sure.
Yeah, it's some classic material, and that stuff was good for the 40s. But as bebop came in and took over in the jazz field, I struggled with that too. I can listen to a little bit, but I don't really consider that my jazz form at all. I can remember going to a jazz at the Philharmonic, 1956. I went because of one reason. Gene Krupa was there. Well, I was in Newark at the Mosque Theater. The audience was largely black, and they did their usual jam session stuff at the beginning, intermission, then the Oscar Peterson trio. The Krupa Quartet came on, which is what I was waiting for. And then Ella Fitzgerald came on, and she was the star of the show. They went absolutely wild.
Well, she was Norman Grantz's biggest star at that point, I guess.
I mean, I knew her name, but she wasn't on the pop charts. I'm listening to K-Star or Doris Day or whoever, Joe Stafford. I'm not listening to Ella. She's not on the pop charts. This crowd is going absolutely frantic. And I said, boy, I got to pay attention to Ella Fitzgerald. Of course, I'm from the lover, but at the time, I was just astounded that with all these big stars there, Ella was the one that took the cake.
Do you listen to Billie Holiday much? Or?
Oh, yeah, I have all Billie. I particularly, I always liked the stuff she did with Teddy Wilson. I thought they were a match made in heaven. But I don't want to denigrate her stuff of the 50s for Norman Granz. You get Ben Webster and a small group behind her, and my God, you've got another match made in heaven. People think, her voice wasn't the same or whatever. I listened to those things from the mid-50s. She sounds wonderful. Norman Granz recorded her very well.
What I find very interesting about the records that she made with Teddy Wilson and with Lester Young, Teddy Wilson and Lester Young in the 30s, is that she was just another soloist within the quartet or the quintet or whatever it was, whereas later on in the 50s she is the star, and the musicians are kind of backing her up, and I kind of like that feel that is created on those 1930s records where basically she is a soloist with all the other great soloists in that studio band.
Yeah, because you listen to those Teddy Wilson sides, and there are dates when she isn't there, and they have some other singer in. And Helen Ward did a session. I like Helen Ward well, and I think it came off well, but it's not the same as with Billy fit with those musicians so well. You know, Helen was a band. You know, she was more a band singer, not so much jazzy, and Billy had that feel, you know, for the small group. That it just flowed. And Lester Young and her, I've never heard two together that just hit it off so well.
Absolutely, there was definitely a connection.
And I say, when I pick up 20 years later with Ben Webster, I think it's very good. It's not the same as with Lester, but
Ben
she
Webster
still was good.
Ben Webster is a great tenorist, though. One of my favorites.
Yeah, he was very good. But, you know, Lester to me was an acquired taste. When I first heard Lester Young, I saw him. Birdland, maybe 1955, opposite the Basie Band. I went to see the Basie Band, Joe Williams, and I'm mesmerized. The other band was a Lester Young, I think it was a quintet. It was terrible. They went through the motions. Every tune sounded the same instruments started, they just went in sequence around, the drummer never varied the beat. I thought it was dreadful. And all I was hoping for was get the band back out here and maybe Lester would sit in for a number or two. Well, it never happened, you know. But it was the only time I ever saw Lester Young, and yeah, it was a bad night. But the Basie Band was what I went for, and it was wonderful. But I didn't pay attention to Lester for years afterwards, and finally when I listened to that early Basie stuff, I said, holy mackerel, this guy was so different, you know, and my God, he just invented a whole new role, you know, and that band took off with it. It was never the same without him, I think. And accompanying somebody like Billie Holiday, yeah, it was magic. It's a shame, you know, that he went downhill like he did. And the war apparently did. You know, it was a bad experience for him, and I don't think he ever recovered totally from that. Although he played well into the 50s. But
yeah, and he remains one of my favorite jazzmen of all time.
I mean, I've got some good stuff by him, but it's that early stuff. The stuff with Basie and the stuff with Billie Holiday. Oh, wonderful, wonderful stuff.
Well, Perry, it looks like the restaurant seems to be about to close, so I do have a final question to finish our conversation here today, which, you know, we're at the Rock and Dough here in Jackson, Tennessee, Memorial Day 2022, talking about Bing Crosby and all of these great bands and musicians from that time period of American music that you and I share in common and like so much. And my final question is, what records by Bing Crosby would you recommend? Records, not just one, but, you know, several if you want, for anyone who wants to get into the vast and absolutely outstanding recorded legacy of Bing Crosby. What records would you recommend to anybody watching or listening to this conversation of ours today?
Well, I think we've touched on a couple of them. I like the jazzier ones, like the Scobie, the one
Bing
with
with the
Scobie. The Bing sings while Bregman swings. Those are my two favorite LPs. I was amazed. You know, I did not collect Bing Crosby Decca LPs. I bought singles back in the day. And it wasn't until years later that I realized all the collections that they put out. You know, there's the country music, there's this, there's that, there's whatever. I love the combinations with the Andrews Sisters, but I also like the 70s stuff too. A Southern Memoir, I think, is my favorite from the 70s. I think the Hey Jude album from the 60s is my favorite from that period, and then the two from the 50s would be the Buddy Bregman and the Bob Scobie.
I do agree for sure about those two from the 50s. I wonder very quickly, what is it that you like so much about Southern Memoir and about Hey Jude, Hey Bing?
Well, you know, it's funny that he did one song on a Southern Memoir that he repeated, that he had recorded with Les Brown some years earlier. And I thought, well, why would he do that? He made the perfect record with Les Brown. This doesn't have the same accompaniment. And that, so I didn't pay attention to the album when I first heard it because of that one song. And then as I re-listened to it, I said, this album really is good. And that song just flows with the album, despite it's not the Les Brown version, but on the whole, I thought the concept was, well, who cares? I don't care about the South in that sense that I want a memoir of it, but I thought every song was carefully picked. The orchestrations were very good, and Bing was in good voice. There's just nothing phony about it. And as good as some of the other 70s stuff was, that one just stands out.
Mm-hmm.
It just stands out to me. And it surprised me that it did, because it was one that I ignored when it came out. It didn't get much of a circulation, and I just didn't do much with it until years later. But that would be my top one from the 70s.
What about Hey Jude, Hey Bing? Why'd you like that one so much?
What?
What about the Hey Jude, Hey Bing? Why'd you like that one so much? Because some people, including myself, that one's not one of my favorite albums by Bing.
What's wrong with you?
Many things, but that might be one of them. I don't know. I just don't feel like...
I was not a Beatle fan, so it wasn't that I was picking up on that. I thought... I didn't realize when he made the album, he was also doing that on TV. He did it, he plugged it a bit. And I thought quite differently. I thought this was something that was kind of foisted off on him as a project, and he did it, and then realized that maybe this was the wrong thing. It's not going to appeal to his generation, which I think was true. Mm-hmm. But there was something about it, and particularly the title song, the Hey Jude. I just thought he did a wonderful version of that. And it flavored that whole album, I think it was the fact that on the liner notes, too, I'm trying to think of who, Jimmy, somebody who, I can't remember the accompanist, but Bowen.
Jimmy Bowen, yeah, who also
and he said the band
Sinatra.
stood up and applauded when the set was finished, and I thought, that's a wonderful tribute to a guy who's not of their generation,
Mm-hmm.
So that particular album, because I wasn't happy with what he was doing earlier in the 60s. I did not like the sing-along albums, and I didn't pay attention to much of else that he did during that period until that one came about, and then, boy, bingo, Bing is back in my life. So that's a good one from the 60s. But, you can go back to, you got to go back to the 40s, too. Just, if you took... I suppose somebody's made an album of all his gold records. Put all his gold records together, and you've got Bing Crosby. There you got it.
Do you like his? I suppose you like his Christmas recordings. We haven't mentioned those in all this time of conversation, but I guess it's probably because those are so well known. At least some of them. Well, what do you think about Bing's Christmas recordings? Is it something that you listen to only at Christmas, or do you do like me, where there are some cases where I actually listen to some of those, and it's in the middle of the summertime?
Well, I've got them all separated into their Christmas albums. So I've got all his Christmas music in one place, and along with my other Christmas albums, and maybe I've got 12 or 15 CDs. I play them every Christmas. I mean, I go through them mechanically, so I play it all, which gives me a lot of Bing Crosby. Otherwise, the only way I'm playing Bing's Christmas stuff is if I'm playing any of the chronological series, and it pops up in the chronology. But, I think he was absolutely the spirit of Christmas. I could listen to it all. I thought, his earlier stuff was very good, and then I listened to the Capitol one he did around 62, and the more I listened to that, I said, my God, this stuff is magnificent. And then the one he did much later in the, a decade later. It took me a while because I wasn't familiar with the songs, but I said, geez, it's all good. It's all good. So, yeah, I've got it all together, but mostly it's Christmas time I play it.
And we definitely agree
But
about that.
Where everybody else thinks of Bing Crosby strictly Christmas, that's just, to me, a small part of it. But nobody did White Christmas like he could do it.
That's absolutely true. It's been done a million times, but nobody has done it like Bing Crosby. Well, it looks like the joint is about to close. Kick us out of here. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Perry Huntoon, the American Vice President of the International Club Crosby. I am the co-editor of Bing Magazine with Malcolm McFarland. And hey, let's not make it another 3 years before we see each other again.
I'm sure. At least hope not. We'll have to make this at least an annual occurrence. So you think?
Absolutely. And anytime you drive down here, we'll get together at this restaurant or another restaurant, because there are other
Are there more?
restaurants.
Okay.
There are
I'll
more.
take your
There are
word
more.
for that. All right. All right.
Thank you, Perry Huntoon, on the Jazz Flashes podcast. Signing off now from Jackson, Tennessee, from the Rock and Dough restaurant here on Jackson Walk Plaza. I'm Anton Garcia Fernandez, and we've been talking today with Perry Huntoon.